Hi, BookTube, and welcome to another review. You'll notice I didn't say fiction or nonfiction, and that's because I've never read a book quite like the book that we're going to review today, and I'm a little reluctant to talk about it. I'm afraid that whatever I say is going to be slightly insufficient somehow, and that you won't really get the information that you deserve in order to make a decision about it. The book we're going to look at today is called Color is the Suffering of Light, a memoir by Melissa Green, published in 1996, 341 pages. And it is a memoir. It does discuss Melissa's childhood from the time she's about 6 until she's about 16. And this was one of my winning titles, TBR, 13 of 18. I bought this purely for the title with no idea of the content. In 2016, the poet Sumita Chakraborty interviewed Melissa Green, and she quoted another poet's description of Green's writing, saying that Green was, quote, fearlessly attentive to the world. Now, I would disagree with the fearless part. I would say she is attentive even though it scares her to death. I would stick my neck out and say she has a sensitivity which doesn't let her be anything except attentive, and that's going to bring her great joy and great pain, and that is what she brings in her memoir. Copies of this book, they're not easy to find. You'll see there's no Kindle edition, and it's difficult to find print editions in the UK and the US. And it's not easy to get a hold of Melissa Green's poetry as well, because she began as a poet. This book is the first foray she makes into writing in prose, but of course it's very different prose because it comes from a poet. But hear out this review, because if you think that the scarcity is saying something bad about the book, I don't think it is. The cover illustration on my edition, it's reproduced from a painting by Edward Hopper. Now, you may think, I don't know that artist, but if I show you one of his most recognized paintings, yeah, I think you know this one of the diner. It's often said that Hopper's work portrays loneliness, and if that's true, then he's the perfect backdrop to Green's story about her early life and her struggles with mental illness. And she even says to one reviewer, "Do you think I've spoken about illness too much in interviews and in the memoirs? How do I explain this? It was hard for me personally to leave out mental illness. I probably discussed it way more than anybody ever wanted to know about it. But it would be like not talking about the elephant in the room. I think for a long time, illness as another was how I defined myself, because I was obliterated for most of my life. With me, it was like there was somebody who wasn't home." And this is an interesting remark, precisely because this memoir, it's such a close-range, detailed look at home and family relationships, but not functional ones. Let's meet the author. Melissa Green was born in 1954 near the town of Townsend, Massachusetts. She was educated at Boston University. She studied under the famous writer Robert Lowell, and her first publication was a volume of poetry in 1987 called The Squanicook Eclogues. And it was a great critical success when it was published. It won the Norma Farber Award from the Poetry Society of America and the Lavan Award from the Academy of American Poets. She made a huge impact as a poet. But then there were long gaps between published works, and Green has openly talked about the deep depressions which have stopped her from writing as much as she wanted to. Her last work was 2015. I believe that's another novel called Magpiety. Now let's talk about this unusual book. We'll talk about setting. Attention to detail was so great in Melissa Green's memoir that I was able to use Google Street View maps and locate precisely the farm where Melissa grew up in the late 1950s, early 1960s. It's like a little space cut out from dense forest on the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border. And there's just a single road and several miles from the nearest small town. And it's not hard to imagine in a situation like this one where you're so isolated, if the people around you are reasonably okay, because you can't ask for much more than reasonably okay, but if they are reasonably okay, you as a child will grow up in that isolated environment reasonably okay. But the people Melissa grew up with were not reasonably okay. They were examples of what the settlement of America can do and did to people. And this is something that's not much talked about, the damage that was caused to people by the deprivation, the sacrifice, and by the narrow understanding of what life could mean or how it could be lived. A lot of people went through a lot of suffering. The first half of the 20th century produced a lot of very, very unhappy people who did not understand their own unhappiness. And then they married and they brought up children. It's a bad idea, but that was what was expected of them. And no other options were on the table of life, so to speak. And Melissa, with her intense, almost personal religion of observation, and she has a very deft kind of diamond cutting facet selection of words. So they capture, the light, and they shine a very stark light on these things. And she opens up the secrets of all these silent Americans who suffered, including herself. To talk about the setting in time, Melissa divides the memoir into 3 sections, which she calls Glass, Mirror, and Prism. Glass focuses on Melissa's early childhood in that isolated farmhouse and the mysterious dysfunctions of her parents, because they are a mystery to a child. Why people are violent, why they are depressed, why they make promises that they don't keep. And then Mirror focuses on the visits that Melissa was obligated to make to her paternal grandmother in Winthrop, which is a very nice community on a little peninsula in Boston. And it's a part of Boston. It's cut off by its geographic shape, so it seems like an island, so there's more isolation, but it was a prettier, more middle-class isolation. There, you are told about the more disturbing dysfunctions of her grandmother, and you can see behavioral signs in Melissa of mental illness, but you also see that 1960s world, it's so ashamed to acknowledge these things, so ashamed to seek treatment, and so, of course, nothing happens. And then in the 3rd section, in Prism, Melissa constructs her family tree. This is a project that it appears that she did while she was staying at her grandmother's house. She constructs a family tree from details that her grandmother recounts to her. But that recounting is colored also by Melissa, fills it in imaginatively and with research. And you start to see what will be the roots of the dysfunction in her grandparents as well as her parents. And that 3rd section, it does shunt back and forth a bit in time. It's kind of like a strangely programmed time machine, with Melissa going back to her grandparents' generation, then forward to her parents, then up to hers, then back to her grandparents again. And it sheds light on why the people in her life are not well. But there's also this constant feeling of motion sickness with all this back and forth. And it's almost a foreshadowing of a mental crisis that's slowly building in our narrator. Narrative viewpoint. It is a memoir, so yes, most of it is first person, but not all of it, because Melissa obviously isn't her ancestors, and she sometimes writes from their viewpoint. And this is why I couldn't decide whether to treat this book as fiction or nonfiction. It seemed clear to me that the account was grounded in a lot of fact, and the stories about Melissa's childhood were memories. You could tell by the strange sensory information that she remembered and recounted in detail. But there was some fictionalization as well. And of course, when the story details the lives of Melissa's ancestors, she'd have to augment that. There simply wouldn't have been enough data that she could have looked up. And I began to think about the facts of her life as kind of a quilt cover, and then what she imagined was like sort of the filling to pad out that quilt and give it body. Melissa mentions, in terms of number of characters, she mentions about 20 living people, and almost all of those are her relatives. Mention doesn't mean that you get any full knowing. I mean, Melissa's isolation means that she meets some family, like her mother's mother, rarely and briefly, and some family members they're only talked about, they're never met. And in this time machine segment bit in Prism, where she goes back a generation or two, there's about another dozen people that the reader meets as part of the whole memoir. But mobility, restriction of mobility, that's an overriding theme. People are tied down a lot. People are trapped. Men go to sea, but then they're injured and their injuries can't be treated, so they're just forced to return to the land and to remain in poverty. Men have to do the work their fathers did, whether they like that or not. Doesn't matter. Women are trapped in unhappy marriages. They can't get out of them. They're trapped looking after elderly relatives. They're trapped by frequent pregnancies. Men can escape. Yes, they go to war. How wonderful, and that mobility can be cut short by a violent death or an injury so that their body never recovers. So one of Melissa's ancestors suffered a head injury, and from that they had seizures and hallucinations for decades afterward. And the only options for her care, there were two. She could be sent to an insane asylum, and of course nobody knew how she might be treated there. So the family decided, no, we will look after her at home. And so that meant decades of her own parents and siblings having to literally tie her down sometimes because they literally couldn't come up with any other solution that would keep her safe and everybody else in the house and everything in the house. Problematic content. Well, you're probably getting the idea already. Melissa Green's memoir is a catalogue of abuse, which she suffered, but also her parents suffered and their parents suffered. You're shown details of domestic abuse perpetrated by men and women, suffered by adults and children. I found it poignant, but if I had to read this book at a different time, I probably would have found it too triggering. It would have been impossible to read. Where I am now is probably the best place for me to tackle the book. So you'll have to make your own decision about where are you and can you tackle the same thing. What I will say is if you are in a place where you can handle it, I have never read an account of human suffering that is delivered with greater beauty. And some people have different opinions about that. If you look at the Goodreads reviews, and there aren't many, you will see that for some people, Melissa's use of language as a poet, trying to bring that into prose, they didn't get on with it very well. In fact, the reviews that you'll find on Goodreads, not very many, and they're surprisingly dismissive. The reviews surprised me because they almost had a so what reaction to all of Melissa's struggles with mental health. And perhaps this is the downside of Melissa, trying to write prose, but bringing so much of herself as a poet. There's very vivid poetic sensitivity to every sensation, every impression. And perhaps that looks like a bit of overkill to some readers. The abuse and the isolation in Melissa's life, it's described, but at the same time, Melissa's also describing how she used her imaginative life and the eloquence of her inner life. It's kind of became a safety barrier so that while she was suffering something really horrible, her mind was noticing something beautiful and absolutely focusing on that, elaborating on every detail of that beauty. And all those words are a buffer in her mind against the real pain she's experiencing. I think what happened for some readers is that they kind of got lost in all the pretty words, which, yeah, some of the metaphors, there were times when I thought, not sure about that one. That seems a bit far-fetched. But so many of them were so, for me anyway, so well chosen, so absolutely spot on that I was able to take them on board. But I think other readers seemed to be saying, no, we found that weird flowery language. We felt she was just making a lot of nothing at all, which I thought was a shame because it wasn't nothing at all. There were some very, very upsetting scenes and she was recounting some very upsetting things. But she does have a real love for simile and metaphor. And I can see that some people found the sheer weight of all that in the book distracting, and it didn't get the right effect. I was aware all the time I was reading, yeah, there's a lot here. And now and again I had a reaction, but it was only now and again. I didn't have the same reaction I had, for example, to Matthew Pearl, where with the Dante Club, I really felt a lot of those metaphors just did not work at all. With Melissa Green, I felt most of hers worked so well that some of them actually made me go, oh, because the picture that came into my mind was so clear. And that is why I've done something I probably wouldn't normally do with a writer who's also a poet. I have included a link in my description box to a video of Melissa Green reading her own poetry. I usually avoid poetry readings myself because I'm really, really, really fussy. I'm actually probably too fussy about how a poem is read. And there you go. But Melissa clicked. I not only loved her poems, but I loved the way she was reading them. I really felt she had a gift, not just for creating the words, but for giving them out to an audience. So none of this is saying, oh, you must love this book. I do think this book will still have its detractors. She has brought a lot of herself as a poet to what is essentially a memoir of child abuse. And yeah, how do you marry up those two things? I felt it went well, but I could understand if someone else opened up this book and thought, what the... And let me read a little passage that might give you an idea, maybe help you to decide yourself. I'm going to read a series of passages that start on page 101 and end on page 106. And this is about Melissa's childhood experience of Thanksgiving. It was Thanksgiving, and we were crying. We were beside ourselves with happiness. Company was coming, and we wouldn't be alone. Granny and Boppa arrived first, of course. Howard and Bunny, Aunt Maggie's dead husband's brother and his wife, usually came. Howard was also our dentist, whose hands shook badly when he worked and who had never heard of Novocaine, but he was soft-spoken, and his face smelled wonderfully of shaving soap and tobacco. His wife Bunny was the homeliest woman I'd ever seen. She was just my height and as wide as she was tall. She had one terrifying eyebrow like a scar across her forehead. Her face reminded me of a mushroom, but I loved her because she seemed to be the only truly happy person there. My brother's godparents, Romy and John Nolan, and their children, Joycey and Bruce, came sometimes. Romy was glamorous, usually dressed in sweeping red and black, drenched in intimate perfume, wearing a fascinating scarab bracelet with necklace and earrings to match. John tickled and teased us unmercifully and was given to loud, boisterous laughter at his own jokes. Joycey and Bruce were close to me in age, but curiously set apart and envied because they were adopted. Marge Sower and her spinster sister Kate often had Thanksgiving with us. They were potters who lived just over the line in Mason, New Hampshire, and had no family of their own. Sometimes one or both of Mama's white-haired widower uncles came up from Fall River, red-cheeked, jolly Uncle Mike, who looked like a Christmas leprechaun, and crabby, opinionated Uncle Frank, who could stuff his entire earlobe inside his ear and make it pop out magically when we clapped our hands. Once in a while, a guest would bring an unexpected cousin or neighbor or maiden aunt I'd never met, but I would not let myself be afraid, because it was Thanksgiving. When the intoxicating moment arrived, I ran out, leaping into the yard with my brother and sister and all of our dogs. We came up to each car, tears pouring down our faces, and flung open the doors. We were crying with relief, with happiness, because it wasn't an ordinary day. We were so glad to see people. If only for a little while, our family would be different than it was, and we would not be alone. On Thanksgiving, we would be fed and fussed over, and when we gathered together for the Lord's blessing, we even believed we could be saved. The back door opened, and the clean, cold air rushed in, and all the windows steamed up with happiness. Husbands slipped wives out of coats, men with glasses and suspenders that held up their big gray pants, women trilling with laughter, clouds of perfume, and rustling petticoats, their faces bright with lipstick and rouge, hugging and kissing us, leaving prints of their bright red lips on our cheeks. We trundled off armloads of coats to the hall closet, where I would stand on a step stool so I could reach, one by one, the coats as they were handed up to me, some too heavy to lift as high as the rod. I buried my face in fur collars and scarves and drank in the smells of toilet soap, cigars, and Dior Kiss dusting powder and Halo shampoo. I heard ice cubes tumbling into the ice bucket, the clatter of glasses, and my father making his famous old-fashioned. The sweet aroma of oranges and Angostura bitters drifted over the kitchen, weaving an invisible wreath around the basting turkey, biscuits, mince pie, and chatter, wafting us finally into the dining room. My father would carry in the turkey and begin carving. Each of the guests brought in a serving dish. My mother lit the candles, the charms on her heavy silver bracelet tinkling toward and away from the flame. Everyone talked at once as they found their seats. The plates were passed around the table to the person on the left, and soon all the guests were sitting before turkey and dressing, mashed potatoes and gravy, cranberry and biscuits. Onto every plate I scooped green peas and baby onions as if each were a serving of emeralds and pearls. There was a peaceful moment when the plates were filled, throats were cleared, and the candles flickered as we bowed our heads to pray. Then my brother stood up to say grace. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty, and thank you for letting us all be here today. My eyes stung, and a tear slid down my cheek, and let us all be together again next year. And that's the review done. I'm hoping that gives you an idea of Melissa Green's book, because it really did stay with me. It's a bit of a unusual text, and so I know it might not be for everyone, but if you do happen to find a copy, I think it will be worth it, especially if you love poetry. I'm doing a lot of filming today, so it's a bit of a back-to-backer, but I can tell you with certainty that what's coming up at the weekend will be a non-fiction review, and that will be carrying on with Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic, and we're going to talk about astrology. So yeah, by all means, check in if you want to see that. In the meantime, good reading, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.